for such a kind introduction. And I want to say before I go any further, how honored I am today to be here with all of you today and to follow after Tony the San Giuliano's award. I have to say, it was touching and inspiring at the same time to hear his words, to be able to meet his son, and to see the pride that he has for our field. Individuals like Tony who carry the baton and push our field forward. And I also want to say how honored I am to be here with all of you, and thank you for connecting today. And you can't imagine how pleased I am to be back in Southern Ontario. And my 4 years at the University of Waterloo are some of the most memorable years of my academic career. A wonderful place, exceptional colleagues, and a place for great scientific thoughts. So on that note, I tried multiple titles for today's presentation, and we came up with this one that tries to put a little bit of a lighter note towards the end of the year. I hope I will serve it properly in the spirit of the presentation. So we're going to see a little bit of the evolution of our field in the last 100 years and throughout different topics. And the whole thing pretty much starts with Terzaghi posing here on the left-hand side, measuring lateral earth pressure with very rudimentary equipment. As you can see, there is a two-plate scale balance on the right-hand side. And it was under such simple conditions that he did most of his most beautiful work soon after he arrived to Istanbul in 1916. And that is where I'm counting the 100 years from. When he joined Robert College, he explored earth pressure, effective stress, seepage, friction, place, piping erosion, shear strength, consolidation. He developed new measurement systems, the foundations for our odometers, permeameters, shear box, and he did some scale models. And he concluded that time writing his first and famous book, Mechanik. What a time! That is a proof that it's not big money that makes a difference in research and progress. It's time for great thoughts. By 1925, he leaves to go to the US and he floats back and forth. We'll come back to the story later on during the presentation, but let's look at our field since then. The field has evolved tremendously because we have had to confront very important challenges related to infrastructure, dams and tunnels, earthquakes. Environmental engineering kept us alive and reinvigorated throughout the 80s and the 90s, and more recently, energy geoengineering. And I wonder what's coming next. We'll try to close with those thoughts. Throughout this evolution, we have also seen significant developments in relationship to lab and field characterization, geophysical methods, numerical simulation. And another important thing, while Terzaghi brought in the mechanics, in one of his early papers in the 1925 ENR paper, he mentions Guy Chapman. He understood that double-layer concepts were coming for place. He got it clear in 1920s. But basically, he brought the mechanics. Gradually, we brought in the physics and the chemistry, and more recently, primarily in the last 10, 15 years, the biology. And so this has been the evolution of our field throughout the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. But let me go back to Terzaghi, because this is such a beautiful statement, which, by the way, I heard it first from Leo Rothenberg at the University of Waterloo, one of those great colleagues at Waterloo. So this is what Terzaghi said in the 1920 ENR paper, Engineering News Record. Coulomb purposely ignored the fact that soils consist of individual grains, because Coulomb had to analyze some big projects, and so he looked at them as an equivalent continuum mass. However, Terzaghi said, look, if we are going to progress in our understanding of soil, we have to go back and recognize that soils do consist of individual grains. So before I go further, let's look at some grains. Look how beautiful they are. On the left, those are carbonate crystals formed in flowing currents. The next one, you see the hexagonal shape of kaolinite platelet, and that is the shape that is because of the silicon tetrahedron forming at the base the silica sheet. Sorry, let me see if I can put the. No, I want to put the marker. Just a second, please. You should see that. These are diatoms, folks. Look how beautiful they are, and that you can look at the whole book, thousands and thousands of shapes. They are just gorgeous. They are made by microorganisms, singular cellular bacteria forming this exoskeleton, almost like we form nails or hair. They form these beautiful little shapes, and these are foraminifera as well. And we find them everywhere. And so if you haven't been looking at them, it's probably because you haven't been in offshore geotechnics or in Mexico City, Lacustrian deposits. The next one, you see all these beautiful little cubes. This is table salt, the cubic packing of sodium chloride. This one is a freshly crushed granite for Portland cement, mortar. And this is rounded Ottawa sand. Old, it has been beaten from all angles and all the edges are gone. Soils are made of grains. And so with that in mind, we're going to advance through several parts. And it's almost like going through the classical soil mechanics text here. But I would like to tell you where we stand at the beginning of the 21st century in each one of them. And so soil classification, stiffness, compressibility, strength, hydraulic conductivity, repetitive loads, and saturated soils. I think that these are flipped. And non-inert, the fact that soils are not inert, and repetitive loads. Let's start. This is Casagrande, and Casagrande was in a bad time after the First War in Austria, and he decided to go and seek new fortunes in the New World. So he went to New York, and he eventually got a job in New Jersey as a draftsman, and from there he went to Boston to seek other jobs. And during his visit to MIT, there he met a fellow called Carl Terzaghi, who had already returned from Istanbul and had gone to Boston, to MIT, initially to MIT, and he accepted the job on the spot to become Terzaghi's apprentice or assistant. Later on, he would take the Casagrande, the chair in soil mechanics at Harvard, and eventually he would hire Terzaghi back into Harvard. Casagrande did amazing contributions. One of them, starting in the late 30s, 36, and then later all the way to 48, the soil classification. And I think, folks, that since the late 30s until now, we have gone through 80 years of geotechnical engineering and gathered so much data. It's time for us to reassess soil classification. And it is important because we're not just giving a name to a soil, we're trying to identify cluster soils according to their characteristics to predict behavior, to anticipate behavior. So these are the very important decisions that we make. There are fine soils and coarse soils. And the distinction is so marked. And the SIV 200 is such a wonderful choice. So much wisdom. Because the fine-grained soils are formed by chemical precipitation, including all the clays, or by thermal processes like fly ash here on the lower part. Look how spherical they are. Like they look like balls that we've hung on the Christmas trees. But these are micron size, a few microns in size. And these are the diatoms biogenetically created. On the right-hand side, it's all about mechanical processes. We crash, we create impacts, completely different mechanisms, completely different shapes. And before I go any further, let me tell you that shape is important, critically important, not only size. If you walk on this crushed sand, this is your footprint. If you walk on this rounded sand, and this is actually Mark Rando's footprint in the southern part of Western Australia, carbonate, rounded, beautifully rounded carbonate sands, you sink. And this is not about capillary forces, and these are all just saturated sands immediately after the wave recedes. So shape is critically important, and we'll come back to that. There's another characteristic that changes across the SIP 200, and which are the forces that control the movement of these particles. If the particles are large, and you could see Tony working on Rockfield, these are self-weight and gravity and maybe some buoyancy counteracting, but it's all about volume. But if there are fine particles, you see that dust gets stuck to our furniture. Those are the electrical forces, and you build sand castles with fine sands. And capillarity takes more and more importance as they become smaller particles. Drags can move particles, but it's tricky because they need to be small enough to be moved away, but not too small to get stuck on surfaces and not to be moved. And throughout all this, the more you load the soil, the more force every particle has to carry for being part of the skeleton. So the governing forces change. And so here now we are converging into what is the critical aspects of soil classification. On the left-hand side, where the electrical forces were important, if you change the pore fluid chemistry, either the pH or the ionic concentration, you change the fabric. Dramatic effects. Beautiful work by Catherine Klein, a former professor at Toronto who passed away too young. On the right-hand side, we recognize one more thing. We already saw that particle shape was important, but now we realize that it's the relative amount of particles. If you have a little amount of fines, the coarse particles form the granular skeleton. But if you have enough fines to separate the coarse particles, now the fine particles control behavior. And this is the heart of soil classification. For the fine grains, now we don't do the liquid limit and the plastic limit anymore. We're doing 3 liquid limits with deionized water, with brine, and with kerosene to control the interparticle forces. We want to see how sensitive the fine soils are to changes in the pore fluid chemistry. And this has a very powerful clustering ability. On the right-hand side, we're trying to find where are the thresholds here where the fines fill the voids. That's a very important threshold because when the fines fill the voids, they plug the voids and they control permeability. And when the fines separate the particles, because at that point, the fines control mechanical behavior. So now we can do this with very simple gravimetric volumetric equations, the second week in any soil mechanics course. And we can put all this in a triangular chart. This is very powerful. On the left-hand side, we are questioning who controls the load carrying capacity. On the right-hand side, who controls fluid flow, permeability. And then we can put nomenclatures that capture both the load carrying capacity and the permeability. Colleagues, these charts and the new soil classification method has been designed taking in consideration not only the physics of fine and coarse soils, but there is huge databases that we have used to identify all the transition points. I can assure you it is very robust and it is very predictive. I strongly invite you to look at this. There are several papers on this, to look at this in detail, and I'll be happy to send you all the information. Towards the end, I'll show you that we have an app that can help you. You just put a few numbers and tells you the full classification. So now let me talk about the small strain stiffness. And in this case is when soils deform, there are two stages of deformation. At the beginning is like two soccer balls that you bring together, they deform at the contact. If you keep deforming, now particles begin moving relative to each other. So there is a deformation at constant fabric, and there is deformation due to fabric changes. Typically, except near the critical point at B/2 of a foundation, small strain stiffness plays a very important role on settlement estimation. And so that is where we're going with the small strain stiffness, and it is so easy to measure with wave propagation, shear wave propagation, that is highly recommended. So let me show you how the soil responds, because at this point is the contacts flattening, the two soccer balls coming together, flattening the contacts. And when you take a soil, let's say an odometer, or this could be a big truck coming on top of a granular base, and as the truck is coming, or as you're putting load in the odometer, the travel times get shorter and shorter and shorter, and then you remove the load, and the contact stretches out again. So you track the changing state of stress very well. And it follows a power equation. And remember this alpha factor and beta exponent, because we have now very large databases for this alpha factor and the beta exponent for different soils, where they are cemented, loose sands, dense sands, clays. Somewhere here would be Mexico City clay. And the same for the beta exponent. And they are intimately related one to each other. As you can see, there are literally hundreds of points. Each of them involves a large number of tests. So this has taken 20, 30 years to put together from the community around the world. Very powerful. Now, what happens if the soil is cemented? Well, imagine that you put now between the two soccer balls, you put gypsum. And now the contact gets flatter, and this is actually salt has precipitated between two spherical grains. And now when I load it, the shear wave velocity doesn't change. It's very stable because the stiffness doesn't depend on the contact anymore. Unless you get to a point that you break the cementation, you go beyond that, and it becomes a stress control again. But this is very important because I would like to highlight that soils have been there for a long time, and they have become friendly with each other, and then this form of diagenesis. And so the contacts are always a little bit flatter than in a freshly remolded soil. And so every time we sample the soil, now imagine the soccer balls, we relax it, stretch, and breaks the cementation between them. And it doesn't matter if you put it back in an odometer or in triaction, you do not recover that stiffness that broke. And we have now lots of data, an original paper with Ken Stokey, but then we have added more data that shows the effect of sampling. If you can measure the shear wave velocity in situ, it will lead to very, very good designs. Now let's talk about compressibility. And let me take you away from soils, because we always talk about the consolidation test, but let's think about the atmosphere. In the upper part of the atmosphere, the molecules, air, which is nitrogen, CO2, oxygen, they are far away from each other. But as the atmosphere gets heavy and heavy onto itself, it has to carry more and more weight. So the atmosphere, the air gets compressed. That is the reason why we have more air at the bottom of a sea floor and near the sea level than at the top of a mountain. This is the same as self-compaction of sediments in the subsurface, exactly the same. And this was, you may remember, Boyle's and Mariotti's law, which van der Waals corrected, etc. I'm going to come back to this. It's exactly the same as soils. So this is the behavior of soils. Folks, we have made it a tradition in our field to show everything in semi-log scale. And so this, which looks almost like an exponential decay, now at some point becomes linearized. And not only that, we force a straight line typically for the stress of interest, but look what happens with a straight line. If you are out of the area of interest, this shoots to infinite void ratio or to negative void ratio. Both of them are incorrect. So our typical Terzaghian model is not asymptotically correct. And if you're working in a broad stress regime, for example, if you're doing anything on the seafloor geotechnics or big stress changes, this will cause trouble. And so what do? Well, we take a double line, what we call here the reloading line, and here the virgin line, and we make magic to find the pre-consolidation stress. And I think that we have to walk away from that. Particularly for numerical methods, it's much nicer to have continuous functions, and so we can modify this equation to make it asymptotically correct, but we can also take other forms of the equation. I noticed that you're going to have Juan Pestana presenting the numerical modeling. Well, Juan Pestana, White, and Whittle use a similar equation. We have rewritten all the equations here to have a similar structure. But these equations are all very good equations. And they are continuous from low stress to very high stress, and you can see them whether it is in linear log on the true scale of nature, linear, you can fit different ways. Shear strength. Shear strength is a complex one. I've been studying it on and off for the last 30 plus years, and we are still pushing it. So this one is a complex one. We really trivialize it. And we think of Coulomb making this experiment, but this experiment is very simple because it's a solid on top of a solid. When you have a soil and you change the normal load, you are actually changing the coordination number. So it's not just friction, it's rearrangement of particles for the new state of stress. So we should probably change a little bit the words, and furthermore, the parameter affects in an exponential form. So if you change 1 degree friction angle in your bearing capacity equations, you know that you blow any factor of safety. So this is a tricky one, and we have to be looking at. Look what I have here. It's a 4-dimensional plot, but just flip it back and forth, and you'll see what I'm talking about. This could be tau, and this is sigma or QP. This is deviatoric stress Q versus axial strain. Just flip a typical triaxial test. This is a dilative sand or dilative soil. This is a contractive one. And this is what happens in volume. This could be, let's say, the void ratio, and where it contracts and then dilates, or where it contracts all the way, if it was on the contractive side. And this is what happens, volume versus axial strain. So typical triaxial test, but put in one plot. And we have to recognize here the peak friction angle, the constant volume, shear at constant volume, the residual one, the angle of dilation, and then the coordinates or the parameters for this line, which is where does it intercept and at what rate. So we're going to try to explore some of this. I'll tell you what is the latest coming out from the data, and why is it effective stress dependent? Why all these parameters are effective stress dependent? And the reason is simple, and I learned this one from Michel Gillickman, working with Maurice Dussault. There are Waterloo. Look at this. These are 4 gears. If one rotates, the other one rotates counterclockwise, 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 and everybody's happy. You can rotate all this. But if you have only 3, this one rotates clockwise, so this one has to go counterclockwise. I think I have the arrows. Let's start with this one. This one wants to go clockwise. So if this one goes like that, this one, counterclockwise. So this one will be clockwise. Now, if this is counterclockwise, this is clockwise. Now, here there is a frustration. This cannot rotate, which tells me that dense granular package, when the sand is dense, it is rotationally frustrated. It will have to either shear at the contact or open up and dilate. Folks, this is the essence of critical state. And in order to slide and to rotate, you can imagine it's very different if it is a smooth circle or if it has these knuckles and gears or this roughness. And yes, particle shape will matter again. And so this is the critical state friction angle, shear at constant volume. And now you see that it is directly related to particle shape. Indeed, we're beginning to understand what is the essence of friction. Now, what happens for dilation? Remember the angle psi that we had? Well, it all depends how far you are from critical state, how much it needs to dilate to get there. So this is Bean and Jeffrey's classical work. And with more data, this really works extremely well. But I caution you out here, because whenever you localize, the rest stops dilating, because that becomes a weak point, and now there is shear localization. So how we interpret our volumetric changes, etc., becomes very tricky. Finally, what is the residual friction angle? Well, if you keep shearing for larger and larger deformations at the base of a landslide, and typically in the laboratory in the ring shear, many things may happen. Imagine of rice grains. We actually did those tests at Waterloo. Rice grains would align, and now they would slide preferentially on top of each other. And if there are fines and coarse grains, the fine grains gradually fall down, and now the coarse grains can ride over a smooth surface of fine grains. And if there are micaceous sands, mica platelets, they will segregate and they will align, forming a plane for sliding. These are all different mechanisms that lead to residual friction angle, and because of platiness, clays tend to give us a very low residual friction angle, intimately related, okay, plasticity index, equally well to liquid limit. If something appears here weird, are diatomaceous soils. If you have diatoms, be careful, and you may go back and see Leroy and Diaz Rodriguez paper on Mexico City soils, where they measure 42, 44 degree friction angle for a soil with a liquid limit of 350. So really impressive. Now, before I leave friction, it's such an important process, I want to say a couple more things. We ignore this one. Imagine that we made the angle of repose, but then we played a trick. At the base, we have a trapdoor, and now I remove the trapdoor and I let the cone fall in inwards. Now I'm going to see that I have two different angles, the internal one and the external one. You see, when you make the angle of repose, two grains at the top go down and separate from each other. They keep moving away from each other. But when they converge towards the hole in the center, two separate grains come closer and closer together. So depending on how you shear a soil in axial compression or lateral compression, you are going to have completely different friction angles. How different? 50% different, not 1 or 2 degrees. This is a huge difference. Frictional anisotropy can be very pronounced. Interesting work coming from the University of Calgary on that one during the liquefaction studies. And so this is real data that confirms what I just have said. I need to move on to tell you that where is the position of the critical state line. Work done, including many tailings studies in Canada, etc. Shows that the position of the critical state line, let's say at 100 kilopascals of confinement, fairly characteristic number for us, is intimately related to the Emax and the Emin. So folks, if you are looking into the critical state behavior, for example, for mine tailings or granular soils, sandy and silts, look at what is Eman and Emax and Emin, and you know that you're going to find the critical state line crossing at 100 kPa, somewhere between these two limits. There is so much we could add, but we have a few minutes left. I'm planning to finish in 45 minutes. So in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to cover a few more topics in geotechnical engineering and how they are evolving with the understanding that we have gained and the data that we have collected for the last 100 years. What about hydraulic conductivity? We mentioned Leonardo before when the early studies of friction, but he also came up with this idea of the parachute. The idea is that if you jump from an airplane, you might as well have a parachute. Otherwise, your velocity at impact will be too high. So why does the velocity decrease? Well, because as the drag increases, the drag resistance and your weight are cancel out. There is no more acceleration and you stop increasing the velocity. That is the essence of it. And this is the essence of hydraulic conductivity. It's about drag along the pore walls. So the more the surface area you have to rub against the mineral, the grains, the more drag there will be and the lower the hydraulic conductivity. That is captured in the Coseni-Karman equation. It's really quite lovely physics and it works. So I'm going to walk away from the theoretical solution to now explore real data, but I know that it's going to be related to the specific surface. And so this is data collected from all over the world, specimens of all kinds, somewhere from bentonites here to sands and silts, and fly ash is somewhere here. And you see, it is not about porosity or void ratio, because clays have higher porosity and void ratio than sands, yet they have lower permeability. So it's not about porosity, it's about pore size. But before I confirm that point, let me show you one thing. All these lines for a given soil follow a linear relationship in log-log. That means that this is a power equation. And the power equation depends on two parameters. One is the permeability at a given void ratio. So let's take as a normalizing void ratio of 1. If the soil doesn't cross it, you can always extrapolate to 1. So this is the void ratio, this is the permeability at void ratio 1. And then I can predict the permeability at any other void ratio. I just need to find out an exponent. Now, if this works, I should be able to collapse all this somehow, and we did it. Remember the previous equation was a function of a specific surface? Indeed, and here we put the void ratio because if I divide these two, I'm actually computing what is the mean pore size. A very easy way to estimate the mean pore size. And look, all this data that was going through 12 orders of magnitude collapses pretty much on a single trend when you plot versus mean pore size. Really amazing. It's almost like you understand God's laws when things like this happen. Huh? And then we wonder what controls that permeability at void ratio 1, and it's all determined by the specific surface. So measure the specific surface and you are going to be right on, and it is so easy to measure. So specific surface, add it to your list of laboratory tests. Why do we have the spread in the data still? Well, because there is something in soils that is similar to society. Only 10% of the parts carry 90% of the load. And then the same happens with pores and fluid flow. About 10% of the largest interconnected pores are responsible for most of the flow. And so spatial correlation and variability are responsible for the less thing. Before I leave now permeability, let me say that we had a model, now new models for compaction, for consolidation. And we have now the power equation for permeability. Now we can approach any problem for consolidation, marine sediments, etc., and walk away from Terzaghi's one-dimensional consolidation, which makes so many assumptions about linearity that in many cases we're going to be violating the assumptions. This one goes back to the fundamentals. I have only 1 or 2 minutes to talk about multiphase fluids, but this is unsaturated soil mechanics. Now, this field is much, much greater than unsaturated soil mechanics, but the unsaturated soil mechanics field has a beautiful, rich history. Go back to Terzaghi 1943, and it is just beautiful to see how well he understood it. And then Atkinson in Australia. And then we jump to Bishop, of course, in the UK, and Bishop and Blythe, and Fredland and Morgenstern, magnificent contribution from 1970s. And that was picked up later on by Alonso and Jens, who brought unsaturated soils and critical state soil mechanics together. These are exceptional contributions, an amazing history in our field. I'm just going to say the following. If we want to understand at the particle level what Terzaghi was saying, you need to understand what is happening at the particle level to feel the soil. In the context of unsaturated soils, you need to understand interfacial tension, the one that lets this spider walk on water, the contact angle, whether the water droplet will curl like water droplet on top of a Teflon pot in our kitchen, or will spread out like on top of a clean glass. We need to understand interfacial tension, contact angle, and the shape of pores, and that is the complexity. Once again, I go back to the work at Waterloo. Doolean's book is just an amazing book, the late Professor Dooley. Now, this is relevant not only to unsaturated soils. If you are in the field of geoenvironmental engineering and you want to understand the Truckman and the remediation for L Naples and D Naples, if you are in oil and gas and you want to recover just 1% of the residual oil, which is huge, probably $100 billion in Saudi Arabia alone. If you want to inject CO2 for geological storage, which we have to do, and believe it or not, but if you're thinking of frozen ground or methane hydrates, the same phenomenon. We need to understand these processes. I will leave it at that, and I'll be happy to come back and chat with you about this. Two more couple of thoughts. One is, please remember, soils are not inert. We tend to see the soil and we think that it has been there forever and it will be there forever in the same form. And if we see the Brumadinho failure of the tailings and the volcanic ash evolving in Colombia, in Manizales, or the thixotropy of Mexico City soil that you miss and then you wait and it hardens, the formation of hydrates, the dissolution of carbonates in Florida, karst terrain, the collapse of fly ash dams in Kingston, desiccation and frozen ground, whether it is in the Midwest or throughout North America. These are all processes that are continuously reminding us that soils are not inert. Furthermore, the loads are not static. And so just a couple of thoughts on this one. This is volcanic ash. It gets deposited. I have measured volcanic ash from many parts of the world, from Pinatubo to 10 different volcanoes. Fresh. It's always the same Boyle ratio. Low specific gravity, amorphous volcanic glass. You come back 5,000, 10,000 years later, it's completely different. It was a wind-blown deposit that it has evolved in situ, and now the Boyle ratio is huge, the specific surface is huge, and this has dissolved and recrystallized to form halosites, immobolites, halophanes with very weird K0. And the weird K0 is such that if you have a chance to go into an excavation, the soil has developed shear failure in contraction because grains are dissolving and reforming. And some of you I know have been involved in this case. There were 6 or 7 corvettes that fell into this hole all of a sudden. And some of you as well have been involved in the Kingston fly ash, one of the greatest environmental disasters, and the Brumadinho. And we have to wonder, how could systems that were stable for such a long time fail all of a sudden? And one possibility, folks, is that if you take fly ash, for example, and many cases tailings as well, and you mix them, you make a slurry, and you measure the pore pressure, the sediments, the pore pressure is gone, but then with shear wave velocity that we show you already so powerful to measure small things, and you monitor how the wave changes with time. After 4 days, the travel time is getting shorter and shorter, the wave velocity is getting higher and higher. A sand underneath your feet never would have more than 150, 170 meters per second. This sand, this fly ash, without absolutely no weight, with no excess pore pressure, without desiccation, with water on top of it, all of a sudden it's becoming cemented and it develops huge stiffness. Now what happens then, if you put another layer, another layer, another layer, this cementation will lock in porosity and then it may suffer internal collapse. We have to be careful with some of these processes. I will jump this. With respect to repetitive loads, don't think only of the repetitive loads underneath a machine foundation or a levee or a wind turbine. Think of repetitive loads for change due to changes in relative humidity. I suffered that one in Georgia. Or changes in temperature. Look at the wrinkles. This is Kerry Rose wrinkles in geosynthetics. Or what will happen with at the sea level begins coming up and saltwater intrusion with changes in ionic concentration. We already show you that changes in pore fluid alters the compressibility, the fabric of the soil. What will happen with cities built on deltas? And what happens with cycles of freeze-thaw cycles, which are already happening in the southern parts, but now are going to begin moving to areas where there was permafrost. And this is a pile where we are either going to inject cold water during the winter or produce heat, all these thermal cycles. What will do? Will the pile ratchet itself down or not? And even sand, just in an odometer, look, these are 10,000 cycles. Look how it began compacting itself in an odometer under K0. Do not overlook repetitive loads of all kinds. And even though this presentation has been all about soils, I'm going to show you an example of what happens in rocks as well. Look at these wedges. Look at this one in particular. During a hot day, all this will expand and this will move a little bit outwards. During the cold night or a cold season, it needs to penetrate. Everything contracts and the wedge will fall a little bit down. Then the next hot season comes and everything expands out. And then the next cold season comes in and this falls down. This will ratchet itself and this wedge will fall off. And wedges are falling off in this the famous Masada mountain in Israel, so important for Israeli history, because of these choke blocks that keep falling off into and ratcheting the way down. So they asked me to put a little bit of a Christmas spirit. I'm not quite sure this is it, but this is Bob Dylan's "The Times Are Changing," and this is the message I would like to leave for closing. The times are changing, colleagues, and where do I think that things are changing? A few examples. Remember the periodic table of elements that we studied in chemistry, yeah? And this was Mendeleev, the one who developed it. When he developed the table, he had less than half of the elements that we know today, but he put all the information in cards, and then he sorted the cards on a table, and he kept sorting and sorting like assembling a puzzle, and he left the holes for the elements that we did not know. Amazing. Well, we are now collecting lots of information because people are contributing, for example, to Wikipedia. What an amazing, amazing resource. And look at the information that Netflix, Amazon, Google, Facebook have about each one of us. They know more than our intelligence officers in the government. They know almost everything about us. Scary, but it's the power of data and data synthesis. So we are doing that for soils. We are compiling large databases of soils. Right now we have more than 6,000 entries, And we put all the index properties on one axis and the engineering design properties on another axis. And the hope is that we are using AI tools and inverse problem solving to predict from simple index properties a self-consistent set of parameters for design, because it's very difficult to feed complex parameters to these complex simulators that we use nowadays. But we also have the soil classification system in an app, which makes it trivial to use. And now this one will talk to that one, and from that one, you will be able to infer a lot about what to expect from the soil. But furthermore, we're developing a large number of very simple but very powerful technology, many of them based on cell phone. Here, Marisol is taking a picture of these little tubes, and the phone automatically tells her the specific surface of the soil. Much, much better than methylene blue and the filter paper. And Gloria is holding a way to determine the grain size distribution. We have multi-physics cells where we measure multiple things at once. With a cell phone, we take pictures with a little lens, which makes it into a microscope, and we determine particle size and particle shape. And from there, we know Emax and Emin and angle of repose. And just in case, we measure the angle of repose with a little cuvette that we have prepared, the internal and the external. And with all these properties, we know so much about sands. And we are even developing a very cheap nuclear magnetic resonance device. Times are changing. These are word counts. These are called n-grams in Google, and it tells you how often certain words are used in books. Soil mechanics was extensively used, let's say, from the late 40s all the way to the 70s. Foundation engineering picked up. Liquefaction, these are Niigata and the Alaska earthquake, and began picking up, and then a couple of more WACs and the San Francisco, etc., and Chile and Turkey, and still comes back and forth after every event, but is fading away. Geoenvironmental engineering kept us busy throughout the 80s and the 90s and keeps going. And now there are new words coming up, and that is climate change, sustainability, carbon geological storage, renewable energies. And I wonder, are we ready for the change? Or conversely, how should we get ready for the change? And times are changing in many different ways. Before it was Europe contributing, and then throughout Europe, and Italy and Germany and France and England, and then Spain and the US, and then Canada, sporadic contributions of other parts of the world, but Australia, but all of a sudden, huge contributions coming from Korea and China. And take a look at our journals. So now we have a distributed knowledge with new problems and new insight and new creativity coming into our field. So in conclusion, we have gone around the world and in these 100 years. There seems to be a need to do a comprehensive revision and then to prune some concepts that probably we shouldn't use anymore and expand on new ones that are needed to confront the new challenges. If we're going to work with models and correlations, it has to be physics inspired. It has to be satisfy the data, be consistent with the physics, be asymptotically correct. There is a revolution going on in experimental methods in the laboratory and in the field. Be careful with shear localizations and localizations of all kinds, in fluid flow, in dissolution, Carter rain, etc. They are really a nightmare. Couple hydrothermal, chemo, biomechanical processes. I didn't have the chance to talk about it much, but remember, soils are not inert and do expect repetitive loads throughout the design life of the structures. And we have had an amazing 100 years. Times are changing, and let's be ready. Let's make the best of it. All this is possible because there is an amazing team working day in and day out in all these underlying concepts. And to them, I'm very grateful to all of you for being here today. And finally, I want to say thank you to join the organizers, to thank our sponsors for this event.